Good evening. It's great to be back here in Glenties. Thank you, Joe, for the invitation. Thank you, Noel, for the kind introduction. As you can see, I'm not Simon Coveney. There are a few differences. He's about 2 feet taller than me at least, and I like to think I have more hair than he does, so that's one up for me, I guess. But this is a subject, I suppose, that I'm very passionate about, so I was really pleased to have the opportunity to join this discussion. And I have some thoughts that I'll share with you, but I'm really looking forward to the exchange between the panellists and also with the audience as the evening goes on. I think at the moment there's a lot in the world that gives us cause for grave pessimism. So my task, or at least I'm going to strive, to inject a little bit of badly needed optimism in our discussion this evening. It's important, I think, to note that while the preamble to the session, if you've read it in the programme, paints a pretty bleak picture, almost of our Armageddon within the European Union, but the EU remains, in my opinion, as one of the most efficient instruments for addressing global challenges and it remains the greatest ever peace project in history. By contrast to the rest of the world, the EU is outward-looking. It's growing increasingly integrated, notwithstanding all of the obvious challenges, which no doubt we'll discuss. Over the past decade, the EU has had to face some of its most serious threats since its formation, including the financial crisis, the banking crisis, the migration crisis, the rise of populism of both the left and the right, and of course Brexit, and we're still grappling with that particular one. The media and political leaders tend to propagate scarce stories about the seemingly continual crises within the EU, and many commentators over the last 10 years, particularly during the financial crisis, predicted the complete collapse, implosion, demise of the European project. In recent times, the current French EU Commissioner said, I think in 2016, Europe must change or risk death. And while trying to secure approval for his budget blueprint last September, the German Commissioner said that the project was in mortal danger. So this is a widely held view, even today. However, the last decade of crisis, if it has shown us anything, it's that the political will for the European project is in fact unstinting. Yes, populist Euroscepticism remains a threat and should not be ignored. But as we've seen in recent elections across the European Union, the EU may have turned a corner against the populist tide, as the huge surge that was anticipated in the European Parliament elections, as Noel has said, towards populist parties and far-right and far-left Eurosceptic parties didn't materialise. Pro-European centrist parties remain in power in the European Parliament, so the centre did somewhat hold, with some centrist parties wresting back control in national elections as recently as in the past few weeks. And in addition to this, European citizens appear to be more engaged with the EU than has been the case in recent decades. Voter turnout in the recent European Parliament elections reached 52%, which is the highest turnout for those elections in 25 years. And while it's not easy to point to the challenges of the last decade while it is easy to point to the challenges of the last decade as evidence that the European Union is broken or is not functioning, there is at the same time a huge amount of evidence to suggest that it does work and it does function, particularly when we compare it to other regions of the world. We have, by and large, of course there are exceptions, but by and large we have accessible healthcare, we have high standards of education, we have access to education, social security, relatively fair justice systems, and safe cities, which in other parts of the world citizens can only dream of. So it's not all bad. The recent elections, I think, show that the far right is not as pronounced as was projected. Pro-EU mainstream parties comfortably have enough seats to form a coalition in the Parliament. Yes, it's fragmented. Yes, it's going to be a lot more challenging to reach decisions and to progress legislation than may have been the case in the last mandate or in the last number of mandates, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. As a former parliamentarian, nothing, and I know Noel Whelan mentioned it in one of the excerpts there, nothing is more frustrating than a sort of an all-powerful centre or executive. And I think that perhaps will be the beauty of the next 5 years in the European Parliament, that there will be a lot of compromising and deal-making, and there will be a requirement to work with a range of political groups, the Liberals, the Greens, etc. There are some key takeaways from the European Parliament elections. It's the first time since the Parliament was directly elected in 1979 that the EPP and Socialists, the centre-right and centre-left, can't form a full majority on their own. The new centrist Liberal coalition is bigger, led by Emmanuel Macron and Rutte and others, now has 108 seats, so a very significant force within the Parliament. The recently elected Parliament is fragmented, but the pro-European Union, pro-integration parties still have a majority. The centre-right, the Socialists, Liberals and Greens and will continue to hold a pro-EU majority in the Parliament. If you look at the top jobs which have been subject to negotiation in the last number of weeks, well, I think it's fair to say that the Spitzenkandidat process is probably dead. In my opinion, it was never a good idea in the first place. It's not backed by a treaty mandate. It never really had the legitimacy of the European citizens. But I suppose what we have seen, and there was a lot of speculation that the European political groups would not be able to agree on a President of the Commission and a President of the Council for quite some time to come. And in fact, they did it in 2 meetings, give or take. And they have managed to come to a compromise with some, I think, balanced, reasonable leadership at the top of the institutions, whether it's Ursula von der Leyen in the Commission or whether it's Christine Lagarde in the ECB, somebody who has extraordinary experience and somebody who's been a great friend to Ireland over the years and is committed to safeguarding the euro. Not necessarily something that might have been anticipated a few months ago. The populist parties, particularly of the far right, did not make the sort of gains that were anticipated. Their characteristic tends to be anti-immigrant, nationalist parties. They did make gains, for sure, particularly the Lega in Italy, the Brexit Party in the UK, and Le Pen's Front National in France. But it wasn't the surge that was predicted. And in fact, across a range of member states, they lost ground. I think it's also important to note that often European voters project their frustration with domestic politics in European elections and perhaps feel that there isn't quite the consequence. So the Front National and others, certainly we've seen it with UKIP over 3 elections. They tend to do better in European Parliament elections than in domestic elections. And I think that probably has been borne out on this occasion as well. But Euroscepticism has been contained to some extent. Gideon Rockman, the wily foreign editor of the Financial Times, observed not so long ago that it is becoming increasingly clear that bad ideas have bad consequences. And I think if we look across the water, and I know we've discussed this in quite some detail already today, I think we are seeing the result of that in British politics, sadly. Populist leaders across Europe realised, as they observed how the negotiations went between the UK and the European Union over the last 3 years, that openly campaigning to leave the EU would in fact start to cost them votes. And actually we've seen a lot of the populist parties pull back from their campaigns to leave the European Union or to pull out of the monetary union, and to actually start to temper their language and talk about reform from within rather than sort of all-out Euroscepticism. And that is a change. I think it means that a lot of the platforms for the European elections were based on far less hardline Eurosceptic manifestos and agendas than might have been the case in the past. For example, Salvini in Italy is now calling for a common sense Europe rather than for exiting the European Union. That in itself is a change. If you strip away the results in Italy and Britain and one or two other countries, some of the nationalist parties had actually quite disappointing results in the European elections. I'll give a few examples. I know Noelle is going to start ringing a bell or stamping her foot or something in a second. But if you look at Finland, for example, pro-European parties, the Greens, the Coalition Party of the centre-right, the Swedish People's Party, got higher support in European elections than in recent parliamentary elections. If you look at the far-right Finns party, they won 13.8% of the vote, which was a decrease. If you look at, in Spain, for example, the socialists sort of resurged, the Social Democrats, the centre-left, and won 20 seats in the European Parliament. The Eurosceptic Vox party lost ground from the recent national elections in April, and they only achieved 6% as opposed to 10% 2 months earlier. So there is something of a trend. Likewise, in the Netherlands, everybody has heard of Geert Wilders. People feared that he would become Prime Minister not so long ago, less than 3 years ago. And in the Netherlands, they gained 3.5% of the vote in the European Parliament elections. Greece saw both the hard left and hard right parties, Syriza and Golden Dawn, taking a pretty grim hammering in the elections, and it precipitated a general election which saw the centre-right New Democracy Party gaining 40% of the vote. They're a pro-European party of the EPP. Even in Germany, the demise of the centre ground has been predicted for quite some time. Yes, the CDU-CSU took something of an electoral hit, but having said that, if you look at where the losses from the centre-left and centre-right have migrated to in Germany, it's been in favour of the Green Party, who had a record 20% of the vote, and the AfD, which was expected a couple of years ago to really sort of steal the clothes of the centre-right. They only won 11% of the vote in the European Parliament elections. And the list goes on. So I suppose what I'm saying is that it's not perhaps quite so bleak as we might have originally anticipated. One thing that I think is always worth noting is that we have, particularly in recent times, focused almost exclusively on populism on the far right. Obviously, Hungary in particular and Poland have very legitimately drawn our attention to those countries and to abuses of democracy, rule of law, and so on. But left-wing populism is also a corrosive influence and is something that we tend perhaps not to focus on so much. I think it's odd, actually, particularly in Ireland, because the only Eurosceptic and significant populist forces in this country have been on the left. And if you look at the rise of Euroscepticism in Ireland, it is really almost exclusively propagated by the hard left in Ireland. And it is a problem outside of Ireland. It's a problem in a number of member states. Romania is a really good example, a very worrying example. And the PSD, Social Democrats, have moved to the extreme left, have really been stoking up xenophobic, nationalistic, anti-immigrant sentiment, using very racist slogans in the recent European elections, and also eroding democracy and being criticised by the EU for doing that. And that's the case in a range of other member states as well. So I suppose in terms of how that impacts in Ireland, well, we've just elected 11 members of the European Parliament. 4 of them are populist Eurosceptics. All of them come from the hard left, and I think it's a cause for concern. They joined a group in the European Parliament called GUI, which effectively makes up about 6.5%, just under 7% of the population of MEPs in the European Parliament. They're a fringe group. They oppose all free trade deals. They oppose European integration. They oppose every European treaty. And they're pretty much an obstructive group. And I think it's a concern that over a third of our MEPs have joined that group. And it's something that has pretty much gone unnoticed and unremarked upon here in Ireland. So maybe to switch it back to the positive, we in Europe, I think, are very hard on ourselves. I think it's right to be self-critical, but we have a lot going for us. And I think when I look at the European Union, to me, it's internationalist, it's globalist. It's about providing leadership on the world stage at a time when other regions and other partners, particularly the United States, are retreating from that leadership role. And we have a huge amount to do to step into the breach. And I'm proud to say that the European Union is doing it. Not in every sphere, but certainly in some. If you take climate change, for example, we've reaffirmed our commitment to the Paris climate deal. We're leading on it. And we're actually now integrating it into our trade agreements. So the somewhat controversial, perhaps in Ireland, Mercosur trade deal, which was reached at political level 2 weeks ago, has put huge pressure on the countries, the Mercosur countries, to basically sign up. And they now accept that pulling out of Paris is almost impossible for them. I think that's a huge feather in the cap of the European Union, and I think we will see a lot more of that. And we have the leverage and the capacity to do the same around human rights and other key issues. On trade, I mean, we totally underestimate what trade has done for this country, for the small member states in the European Union, for the EU as a whole, in terms of raising our standards of living, raising the wealth and the living standards of our citizens. The EU has 39 trade agreements with 69 countries already in place. 31 million jobs in Europe depend on our exports. So these trade deals are massively important. And at a time when other countries are trying to pull out of trade agreements or rewrite them or suggest somehow that they are negative, I think the leadership that's being provided by the European Union is just so vital. And we have ongoing or almost concluded fully ratified deals with Canada, USA, Japan, ASEAN, Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, India, Australia, New Zealand has just opened up, Mercosur, which I've mentioned, Mexico, Chile, Turkey, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Serbia, Morocco and Tunisia, all currently in some shape or form under negotiation. And we have trade talks with the United States of America as well, challenging as that may be at this point in time. These are hugely important and something I think that we can be extremely proud of and ambitious in terms of how we approach them. So I suppose to sum up, we certainly face challenges, and yes, we do face adversity. Everything is not perfect, for sure. Much can and should be improved within the European Union, and I have lots of thoughts on how that should happen, and I'm sure we'll get into it as the evening progresses. But it is important that we take time to reflect and appreciate the successes over the last several decades, effectively since the end of the Second World War. The European project and its impact has just been remarkable. The economic change, the social change, the progress, I think most importantly, and it's so easy to forget it, the peace which has been achieved across the continent and on this island. They are nothing short of a miracle. Very few political projects set out with this level of ambition and actually succeed. So we can't take it for granted. We have to strive to improve, but we have to do it on our own terms. There are enemies outside of Europe who wish us to fail. There are also enemies within, in governments within EU member states, sadly. They're usually, by the way, inspired and often bankrolled by those same enemies without. But we owe ourselves the self-belief, the self-confidence to continue on and to never have our path dictated by those who have an interest in seeing us fail. We would do very well, I think, to follow the wise words of Winston Churchill, a great European and apparently an inspiration to the incoming British Prime Minister. And he said, "You'll never get to the end of the journey if you stop to shy a stone at every dog that barks." So I think we can concentrate on the negatives and be derailed, or we can focus on the future, be bold, brave and ambitious, and and not be deterred by the detractors or our enemies outside. Thank you.